Hi all. I hope you guys have written answer to today's question. And today our question was on modern history from GS1. And I'm also urging you guys to please go on the website of CollectorBabu, get these answers, these questions evaluated for free. Okay? That will be beneficial for you. Let us begin. I'll be sharing my screen and then you can have a look at my screen where I'll be discussing the question. There were three questions today. One was the comparison between ideas of Mahatma Gandhi and Rabindranath Tagore, and one was about famine, and the third one, let's wait a minute here. And the third question was about Lord Curzon and implication of the policies initiated by him. Let us begin. What was the difference between Mahatma Gandhi and Rabindranath Tagore in their approach towards education and nationalism? So, there are two facets to it: approach towards education, approach towards nationalism, and difference between Mahatma Gandhi and Rabindranath Tagore on those two bases. What are we going to do? We'll talk about we'll give a small introduction, giving an insight into Mahatma Gandhi and Rabindranath Tagore and their role in Indian freedom movement. Post that, we'll be making a table of difference. There is two approach how you can address this question. One is to combine both these uh, in a similar table, education and nationalism, in a way that I have done. Or what you can do is make a table and give the subheading difference between their approach on educational matters, and then make a table of difference, write aspect and 2 or 3 points, whatever comes to your mind. And then you can talk about the same thing on the issue of nationalism, make a table of difference and write that perspective. So, what will be writing? So, in terms of education only, we'll first talk about the philosophical orientation. This actually comes in nationalism part. We'll talk about the traditional village-centric approach, and here the approach based on universal liberal humanistic border values transcending international borders. Educational approach, basically we know about Nai Talim, where Gandhiji emphasized on reforming head, hand, and heart. Okay, so 3H. And in Rabindranath Tagore, his version was based on learning scientific knowledge, on arts, experience of individuality, and complete holistic development, but a focus on liberal science, liberal and scientific study. Okay, so, in terms of institution, Gandhiji, he propounded localized school. For example, during various phases of the nationalism, during the during this non-cooperation movement, what was done? A lot of educational institute was set up. So, Bihar Vidyapeeth, Kashi Vidyapeeth, Gujarat Vidyapeeth, etc. So, that resonates more closely with Gandhiji's idea. And with regard to Rabindranath Tagore's idea, he founded Shantiniketan with a blend of Eastern and Western educational ideals. Then we can talk about some key works. For example, Mahatma Gandhi wrote Hind Swaraj, and Rabindranath Tagore he wrote Gitanjali. Further, what will we be dealing with? We'll be dealing with how what was the emphasis of these work. For example, in Swaraj's most important emphasis was on self-rule and ethical governance, which encompasses the domain of nationalism. And in works like Gitanjali, Gora, etc., Rabindranath Tagore critiqued narrow nationalism, which bordered on chauvinism. So, with respect to nationalism, what were the difference in the ideas? Nationalism of Gandhiji was rooted in Swadeshi and self-rule, and most importantly, Rabindranath Tagore was critical of aggressive nationalism. He emphasized cosmopolitanism, global humanism, etc. And the economic vision of Gandhiji was based on self-reliant, self-sufficient village industries. But for Rabindranath Tagore, economic modernization at the same time a blend of cultural value was sine qua non. Then cultural integration. Most importantly, Gandhiji was a he hardcore rejected Western cultural domination, and his emphasis was on reviving traditional Indian industries and India's cultural values. However, Rabindranath Tagore advocated for synthesis of the value of both East and West. And he was critique of oppression, particularly non-violent resistance to colonial rule through satyagraha. Rabindranath Tagore, even he critiqued colonialism, but also the internal social equality, which Gandhiji, for example, with regard to caste basis or something, which Gandhiji overlooked in a way, because first his idea was to get India free from the grip of colonialism and reform Hinduism, but not critique caste system. But for Rabindranath Tagore, these internal social inequality, you also saw them as a source of oppression. So, after making the table of difference, we can just conclude that we can talk about how Gandhi's vision was rooted in tradition and Tagore transcended boundaries. You can also conclude by saying how Gandhiji and Rabindranath Tagore, they both played a very important role in Indian nationalism. How one inspired the cultural aspect of Indian nationalism and one led the political nationalist movement. Okay, so now let us go to the next second question, which is why was there a sudden spurt in famines in colonial India since the mid-18th century? What is this mid-18th century? Basically, 1750s onward, like after the, mm, around the time of Battle of Plassey, Battle of Buxar, etc. Post that, when British rule, it gained a stronghold over Indian subcontinent. Okay, and give reasons. What you can do here is talk about some of the major famines during this time, post 1750s, and you can begin with a quote. For example, here I have used a quote how William Digby described the colonial era as a time when India became the graveyard of its peasantry. You can, whenever you're talking about peasant exploitation, peasant problem, farmer issues in the colonial time, you can use this quote, or whenever even you're talking about famine or agricultural distress, use this quote. What is being asked here? What are the reasons that led to it? So we'll talk about the factors that led to the sudden spurt in famines since mid-18th century. We can divide it in three heads: economic exploitation, administrative mismanagement, and some environmental factors and market forces. For example, what you can write in this environmental factors and all, market forces, how the fate of one part got linked with the other through British rule. So deficiency in one area got reflected in other part as well, and which led to aggravating famine situation. Also, well, it is because it is specifically asking since mid-18th century, that means we can actually talk about everything that happened post 1750s, all the famines and all that that occurred post 1750s. So for talking about linking of the fate of one region to other, you can very clearly talk about how railway as an institute, as an infrastructure which connected one region to other, aggravated the situation of famine, where even though taxes and all were collected, but food were not transported, but it was used as a source of exploitation to serve colonial interest. Okay, so economic factors mostly we'll talk about drain of wealth, exploitation via revenue and trade policy. We'll talk about commercialization of agriculture, focus on cash crop, reduced food in availability. Here you can give example like about the Tinkatia system, how the peasants were forced to grow indigo on 3 by 20th of the land. Okay, you can give example of any, or you can talk about how Neil Darpan talked about uh, forcing peasants to grow cash crops, and that was exported to British. And you'll talk about high land revenue demand, heavy taxes and the permanent settlement system, deindustrialization, decline in rural industry led to agrarian overdependence. Okay. And they were actually, because the patronage was lost, because the princely state had to go under either subsidiary alliance, doctrine of lapse, etc. So, what were the factors under administrative mismanagement? You can talk about neglect of the public work, neglect of famine relief measures, neglect on improving agricultural productivity or irrigation, etc., and disruption of the local system. For example, none of the granaries, etc., was actually set up so as to deal with such exigencies, and prioritization of British interest. Environmental factor, you can talk about monsoon, variable monsoon, as has still been the case. Then how are you going to conclude? We have learnt about some of the committees while preparing for prelims, for example Starchy, Lyell committee, etc. You can talk about how these commission were set up to actually suggest famine relief measures. However, not a lot of those were followed. Also, you can talk about only post Green Revolution and setting and having a democratic governance setup led to no major, or in fact no famine in India post independence. Okay, so let's go to the third question, and this will be the last question for today. So, evaluate the policies of Lord Curzon and their long term implications on national movement. So Lord Curzon as a figure has both good as well as bad legacy. We mostly know him for his bad legacy. For example, Partition of Bengal, Calcutta Corporation Act, University Act, but there was some good. For example, Ancient Monument Preservation Act, which sought to protect, preserve Indian culture and heritage and historical sites. Okay. So let's evaluate the key policies of Lord Curzon. We'll give a small insight into his reign, for example, from 1899 to 1905, and he initiated several reforms and has been criticized for his imperialistic approach. Okay, partition of Bengal into East and West Bengal, both based on communal lines. Universities Act curbed universities' autonomy, brought stricter government control. Ancient Monuments Preservation Act to protect historical sites. Agrarian policies, peasant unrest grew because of the oppressive land revenue system. Okay, talk about Calcutta Corporation Act, reduced Indian representation in the municipal governance, thereby limiting Indian political participation. Railway expansion for trade and administrative purposes, but mostly to serve British interest. Military reform, for example, strengthen British military presence in India. What are the long-term implications? So, under Curzon, we would actually find that there was a period of rise of extremist leaders. For example, the Lal Bal Pal trio, it gained prominence due to the repressive policies followed by Curzon. Then you'll talk about unity across community, as was seen during the partition of Bengal, how Hindus and Muslims, they united opposing the British idea of partitioning Bengal. They tied Rakhi on wrists of each other. Then we'll talk about how it strengthened the Swadeshi movement itself, giving a boost to local industry. You can give some example like Swadeshi Steam Navigation Company. You can give example of cultural renaissance where national education was promoted, and you will give example of foundation of future movements, like a lot of events that took place during the Curzon rule, especially uh, especially around the Surat split time or the Swadeshi movement time. What happened? An array of techniques were put into force. For example, from jail bharo to working for upliftment of lower caste, or to foster Hindu-Muslim unity. A lot of measures, from non-cooperation to passive resistance to civil disobedience, an array of tactics were thrown into the domain to lay a groundwork for later Gandhian mass-based movement. What will you talk about the British exposure of exposing British intentions, like revealing how really their exploitative nature is? And lastly, talk about the political consciousness, increasing Indian participation in movements. Okay. And for long-term implication, you'll also talk about incident like Surat split, which actually in a way benefited British by which actually led them to encourage following carrot and stick policy by pleasing the moderates and um, aggravating and oppressing the extremists. Okay. And at last, you can talk about how his legacy is aptly summarized by Bipin Chandra Pal, when he says, Curzon hastened the day of reckoning for British rule. So this is the end, and hope you guys have been writing a lot of questions which have been posted till now, and take benefit of this initiative and keep writing and get it evaluated. Bye bye.